All right. I'm Reverend Allison Palm. My pronouns are she, her. I serve as the minister at the UU Church in Nashua. I am a white woman with short brown hair wearing a blue shirt and a black blazer.
I'm Roy Goodman. I am a mid-70s white guy. I've been a member of this church for about 26, 27 years. I am wearing a gray shirt and blue jeans.
My name's Tristan Husby. I've belonged to this church for almost 10 years, and I am a white guy with a beard and brown hair and glasses, and I'm wearing a blue button-up shirt and a black blazer.
I'm Harry Perkiser. I've been a member of this church since the 1980s, which makes me sort of the greatest generation era white guy with silver hair and beard. That's it.
I'm Kathy Fletcher. I also am a member of this church. I'm a white cisgender woman living in a larger body. I'm in my late 50s. I have dark hair that's going gray, and I wear big, dark rimmed, thick glasses.
Great. Well, we're going to tell this story today of how we did this research project around the Campbell family. And I want to start way before we knew about Jeffrey Campbell. So, Kathy, can you tell us, where does the story start?
I can tell you. I was part of our church choir and was friends with 3 other women in the choir, and we decided we all liked each other, and we had some things in common. We started going out regularly for dinner. And at one of those dinners, we were feeling very unhappy with the state of the United States. It was a time where it felt like every week black people were being killed by police. And it was just after the death of Sandra Bland, who in Texas, and the 4 of us sort of sat together morosely saying, you know, it's terrible what's happening. And I remember saying, we are 4 middle-aged white ladies. What are we going to be able to do about this? And one of the other clever church ladies said, we are members of a church, and we're getting a new minister. And we should write a letter to the new minister and ask her if we can hang a Black Lives Matter banner at the church. So we did.
And my response to that letter
That's right.
was yes, but if we're going to do it, it needs to be a lot more than that.
Yes.
And I can't do it alone. We need to do it together. And so what were some of the things we did next? What happened next?
We decided we needed more education. And we have a very active social justice group within the church, ironically, which I was not a part of, but became part of because they adopted racial justice as their issue of the year. And we invited a noted teacher of UU, specifically like UU racial justice, to come in and teach a 6 or 7 week class ending white supremacy. And we invited someone from Black Lives Matter Boston to come and speak to us, and invited the congregation to hear that person. And so our first, like all, in my mind, social movements, we had to start with consciousness raising and education.
Yeah.
So.
And in the midst of this, we had the great opportunity that the men's lecture was happening in Boston, and Reverend Mark Morrison Reed was the person who was going to do the men's lecture, and some of us went.
Yes.
So some of you who went to that, what happened at the men's lecture?
Well, we were listening to the lecturers, and the minister, the lecturer, Mark Morrison Reed, was telling us about black ministers in the UU Unitarian and Unitarian Universalist faiths. And he mentions a black minister by the name of Jeffrey Campbell, who had, as a youth, gone to church at the Universalist Church in Nashua, New Hampshire. Well, we're from Nashua, New Hampshire, and we looked at each other and said, we don't know who this is. We've never heard of him. And that was really sort of the impetus for beginning to do some kind of serious research, digging into our own archives. Well, calling them archives is probably not correct, but it was a closet full of stuff. And so we found some items there. For instance, the membership book where he and his mother Lillian had signed as members of the Universalist Church in Nashua. Of course, that Universalist Church and the Unitarian Church merged in about 1957, I believe. And so we began to think of this young black preacher as being a spiritual ancestor of ours, specifically ours. Here was a man that we'd never heard of that apparently had some influence on Unitarian Universalism, and we wanted to know more about him. So we started the research project.
And I will say that we also did reading outside of the archival work as well. So we looked at Reverend Mark Morrison Reed's book, Black Pioneers in a White Denomination, as well as John Hurley's chapter about Jeffrey and Marguerite Campbell in Darkening the Doorways.
And then, we got the team together to try to find out, well, who was this guy? What did he experience in our church? And one of the things we did was to look in the local newspaper, because one of the wonderful things about being in a relatively small city is that local newspapers covered everything. And so we found many references to Jeffrey and Lillian and Marguerite as they participated in events at the schools, and certainly as they participated in events at the church, whether it was pageants or plays or whatever. And it was obvious that this family was very involved in the church and also in the community. And then the school yearbooks would also, again, showed Jeffrey in particular. Marguerite was a little more reticent, but Jeffrey was active in all kinds of societies, and he was, both of them were editors of the school, of the yearbook. And, and he was a poet, and he was in debating club, and all kinds of stuff. So that was, that began to sort of fill out their early lives in our city.
Thank you, National Public Library.
Yes.
And we even found out that Lillian was the church secretary for a while, right?
Right.
So they were clearly very involved in the church and in the community, and so I think it continued to mystify us that we had never heard of these folks, particularly since Jeffrey became a minister and Marguerite worked for the denomination, and so it seems like they're important figures in our history. So we started to dig a little deeper. Where do we go next?
Well, I think the next step was General Assembly in 2017. I was there, and also there was the Hollywood Theological School Library. And some of their folks over there had a booth, and I went up to them and I asked them, do you have anything on Jeffrey Campbell? And this person I talked to looked up on her computer and said, yeah, we've got quite a bit. Would you like me to send it to you? And I said, yes, please. And sure enough, 2-3 weeks later, I get these files of, PDF files of dozens of documents about Jeffrey Campbell. Letters he wrote, letters written to him, letters written about him. Just a whole trove of information that we never knew. And so that set us off in a whole new direction in trying to figure out just what went on and who he was. And is this the time to mention some specifics of that information?
Yeah, I would love to hear if there was a place in this research where Jeffrey really came alive for each of you.
Well, for me, in this research, one of the last letters in the group, which was written towards the end of his life, he died in '84, and I think this was from '82, '83, was a letter written to a friend of his who was also a UU minister. And he was talking about his life. And one of the things he said was that one of his big disappointments in life was that he had never been invited to preach at his home church. And that really got to me. That really got to me. I mean, this was in the early 1980s. It wasn't 100 years ago. It was in my lifetime. It was a few years before I joined the church. Well, about 12 years before I joined the church, 15 years. But yeah, that really hit me.
And it was certainly in the living memory of a
many
lot of
people.
folks in our
Yeah.
congregation. We have a lot of long-term folks, including one person who grew up in the Universalist Church as well and remembers the Campbell family. So it really wasn't that long ago.
Yeah.
And you were talking about things that we found that really moved you, and I'll say that at this point we already knew that we wanted to share our research with the congregation, but we also then found out something that gave us a specific goal to work for with this research, because we discovered where Jeffrey Campbell and Marguerite Campbell were buried.
Here in Nashville.
Yeah, here in Nashville.
University of Lawrence.
I'll pick this up. I think we didn't do research there, but one of the things that we learned was that he was the first African-American student at Lawrence Theological School up in northern New York State. And there's a whole bunch of correspondence about whether he should or shouldn't be admitted because of his race. I mean, the letters are pretty blunt. And there's a whole lot of correspondence once he graduates. What are we going to do with him now? Is he going to be able to find a ministry? Is he going to be able to find a church?
Is there not also, are we going to ordain him?
Mm-hmm.
Are we going to ordain him?
Yeah.
And if we do, will he find a church? So that was all in those letters. And one of the other, if we want to go in that direction, one of the other areas of research we did is we used resources like Ancestry and Find a Grave. And in Find a Grave, we discovered that Lillian, Jeffrey, and Marguerite were all buried in the same grave right here in Nashua, New Hampshire, at the Edgewood Cemetery. And I was tasked with going to find the grave. So I set off and I went. You know, the Find a Grave website gives you
Map.
a map of where the grave is. And I can read a map. And I followed the map and I went there and there was nothing. And I looked around and I couldn't find anything nearby. And I saw that the office door was open, the cemetery office door. And so I walked over there and there was somebody there and I asked him and he went and dug in the files and he came out with a hand drawing showing where this grave site was. And I looked at the drawing and I said, well, I was there. I can't find anything. He said, well, let's go and have a look. And he walked me over to the place and he said, it's right here. And there was nothing there. There was no stone. And that was just, talk about canceling people. It was just devastating. And when I brought that information back to the team and to Allison, it was obvious that we now knew what we had to do, and we had, we had some goals to set.
Yeah, and so we did set a goal of, we knew that in order to properly set up a stone that would be a marker commemorating the Campbells, we had to be in touch with the living relatives. And so we just used some basic internet search skills to find Jeffrey Campbell's surviving daughters and got in touch with them. That took a little while, and as we were working on that, we continued to research and find out more about the Campbells and their lives, including things like the yearbook. And I remember feeling very excited seeing that list of all of the activities that Jeffrey was involved with at the Nashua High School, because it suddenly made it click for me why he was also a dedicated educator throughout much of his life, because while in the 1930s and 40s, when he was stuck in the United Kingdom during World War II, he did adult education to support himself there, and then afterwards, when he came back to the United States and he couldn't find a full-time paying ministry position, he supported himself as a high school teacher at the Putney School. And so it was clear that school for him was a place where he felt those kinds of connections and sought them out later in life as well.
So you found this unmarked grave. You found out that Jeffrey has 2 living daughters. And I remember kind of two reactions that came up from you all. One being, we want to put a grave marker here. But the other being, we want to apologize for this. We want to, when we reach out to these relatives, Jeffrey's relatives, his daughters, we don't just want to ask them if we can put a grave there. We want to let them know that we're really sorry for what happened to their father, and how not just our congregation but our whole faith treated him. So you want to talk more about what was it like composing that apology letter to them? I remember a lot of work went into it.
Yes, I remember a lot of work went into it. I do feel like, though, in some ways it wasn't as hard as you might have thought, just because it was so clear from the many years of service by the Campbell family that the faith meant a lot to them. And then, of course, there's Jeffrey's famous words from the letter to Dottie that Roy talked about earlier, where he says, "I would still undertake the call if I had my life to relive." So it's clear that this family felt like it was clear that this family had absolutely no ambiguity about where they wanted to be. It was just a question of them being treated horribly by the people around them because of their race.
And what happened next?
I think, well, what happened, a whole bunch of things were going on. One of the things was we needed to educate our own church community about what we had found. And the way we did that, we sort of took several approaches, but we decided we had to have a service in which we presented all this information. And we also put together a display of many of these documents, highlighting some of the key issues that were brought up, and also highlighting some of the things that Jeffrey and Marguerite did within the church. Jeffrey was, in 1968, he delivered the sermon at UUA, the sermon of the living, at the service of the living tradition. Somehow we haven't been able to find a copy of that sermon. It seems to have vanished. Nobody knows where it is. But he delivered that sermon. He was also very actively engaged in the community. He ran for,
Governor
I
of
think he ran for
Massachusetts.
governor of Massachusetts at one time. He went on speaking tours with all kinds of influential people. But anyhow, we wanted to present all of this to our own community as a starting point, and also the whole issue of the gravesite. And so we did. We put together the service and presented all of it. And I think people were blown away. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was just a very intense experience.
It felt to me, I wasn't part of the service then, and it felt to me that putting a grave marker on their grave would begin the beginning of atonement. It felt like a very necessary atonement.
Harry, were you involved in putting it together?
Well,
Making
as
the
part of
process?
that, we had to,
Wait, sorry. So start fresh, like as part of educating the congregation.
well, as part of the whole process of recognition of the Campbell family, we decided that we had to, with the family's permission, put a gravestone up. And we had to, first of all, clear that with the cemetery and make it, they would only accept a flat stone, so that's what we created. We also started a fundraising campaign to pay for that. So in order to pay for the gravestone and other things, we started a Faithify campaign, which raised a fairly significant amount of money, with which we were able to not only purchase and install a gravestone, but there was some remainder which we then donated to the to BLUE, the Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism, and we've attempted to maintain that some donation like that in succeeding years.
Hold on, first we took the service to the UU Church of Brattleboro, Vermont, where
Oh.
he had been a part-time minister for many years
Right.
and shared the story with that congregation, which is why their minister, Reverend Shana Pellon, then came to the unveiling of the marker and that whole service as well.
But
I think we're getting two things
I think
mixed
we
up.
were,
Yeah.
because we had a service where we had to educate our own
Yes.
Right.
folks, and then
Right.
we had the Faithify.
and then we have
And
the
then we
Faithify.
raised the thing, and then hooray, we have enough money, so now we have the next service, which we invite the
Yeah.
whole city of Nashua and the mayor and, you know.
But it was, yeah, my only thing was it was at the church, not the cemetery. Like, we started at the church and then we went over to the
Yes,
cemetery.
yes.
Yeah. So you all sent a letter of apology and to the daughters and asking permission to put up this gravestone, and what did you hear back?
Yep, so we did eventually hear back from both daughters, and we got their blessing to move forward with the headstone, and they appreciated our apology, and they did share a little bit about their aunt, and we were very excited then to be able to move forward, and and while it was very satisfying to be able to say we had reached that milestone, we also knew that there was still a lot of sadness there as well.
Yeah, one of the daughters described the aunt as the saddest person she ever knew,
Mhm.
right? That was brutal.
All right, so now you raised all this money for the gravestone, And tell me about the service. The service of, we called it a service of remembrance and reconciliation. And that was in September 2018. And we started with a big service here at the church. You want to share more about that?
We invited the mayor of the city and all the aldermen. We invited folks from the NAACP of Nashua. We invited, who else? People from the UUA. And yeah, people from UU congregations from around the northern district. And a lot of folks showed up.
And in the service, we told the Campbell story again. And we also had some speakers. Were there any of the speakers that felt particularly powerful to you all?
From the UUA came Carrie McDonald, and they read an absolutely radical, humility-based apology to the Campbell daughters. And I personally, at the time, I don't know how the daughters felt, but I thought, wow, that's what needs to be done. That's what we need to do. It was very moving.
And then we made our way over to the cemetery, and there was a little bit of speaking, and the marker was unveiled. Oh shoot. And also, meanwhile, back at the church, we had also revealed that this room that we are in now was going to be renamed the Campbell Chapel in honor of the Campbell family.
And because we had extra money from Faithify, we put a plaque with the Campbell family name on it, which Roy will talk about why he thinks that's great.
Well, yeah, the plaque has their names, and it has the quote that Tristan mentioned a little while ago, that where Jeffrey says, if I can't remember the exact words.
I would still undertake the call had I my life to relive.
There we go. And alongside that plaque, we have 3 or 4 of the 11 by 17 panels that we had put together for the original service to educate our community. And the reason that's all up there is, hopefully, and I think it does happen, is that when visitors come to this part of the church, or when kids are in this part of the church, because this is also the faith formation wing of the church, and they see that, they will ask the question, who are the Campbells? And why are they important? And we can tell them. So yeah.
We also made it really clear at the service that we weren't going to let this story be forgotten again. Part of the reason we wanted to rename our chapel after the Campbells is that we knew that, you know, we were putting up this gravestone and that was one way they could be remembered. But that's, 10 blocks from here. And in the middle of a cemetery that we don't go to that much and could easily be forgotten again. And so we wanted something in our church building that would remind us that this family is a part of our history, that they were our spiritual ancestors, and that we would never let their story be forgotten again.
As you talked about how far the graveyard is from here, I was really struck by the very sad irony that we have a graveyard in the backyard of our church, and yet the Campbells weren't buried there either. So
Yeah.
Well,
we did the Campbells wrong repeatedly.
And at after the service in the church, we all headed over to the cemetery, and had a good gathering of people there, and did a graveside remembrance service. Was there anything that struck folks from that experience? I found it really beautiful when we, at the end, everyone had been given a flower who came, and we invited folks to place their flower on the grave as a sign of our commitment to continuing to tell this story and to continuing to work for a world where what happened to the Campbells doesn't happen again, where we don't have folks experiencing that kind of racism or any kind of racism, either in our faith or in the larger world. And it was beautiful to watch. I was up at the front, and so I got to watch as people placed their flowers on the grave, and I was struck by the reverence with which people did that. That there really was a sense that people took a moment to think about it and didn't just kind of toss it on the grave, but they took a moment to, I hope, internalize that commitment. And we covered that grave. It was fully covered with flowers and with our commitment to the future. And I remember Harry was trying to get a picture of it afterwards and had to kind of move them aside a little bit so that we could still read the names. So that was a powerful part for me. And what happened after that? So we said at this service multiple times that we weren't going to let them be forgotten, right? And so we have stayed committed to that. And some of y'all started by taking the service on the road.
That's right.
Yes, so we shared the service beyond the congregations that Jeffrey himself had preached at. We then started taking the service to just other UU churches in New Hampshire, as well as Vermont and Massachusetts.
Want to say that? First you and then Harry.
Yes, we took the service to 7 other congregations, and all of those congregations were moved and surprised by the story. I say not infrequently that most UUs remember James Reed, but we don't remember Jeffrey Campbell. We were abolitionists. We were fighting for the right side in a lot of ways, and we were also not letting Jeffrey Campbell have a pulpit. So, but the service was well received was very hopeful to me. That nobody came up and said, "What do you mean?" No one fought us about the truth of our story, which I think in other situations there might be some gaslighting, like that didn't really happen, but it did. And so we had a good experience there.
And we also then, as part of that, we also then created sort of a video version of the story, which is a little more condensed, probably only about 20 minutes versus an entire 50-minute service. And we've taken that now to the local chapter of the NAACP and got some very good feedback and some perhaps other opportunities to take the Campbell story to other parts of at least New Hampshire. So that's been a pretty exciting part of the adventure, I think.
The story also got us, helped us build some connections in New Hampshire, I think, because we, especially I'm thinking of, we connected with the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire, which is an organization that is committed to telling these stories of New Hampshire folks, of Black New Hampshire folks from our history, and sharing the story helped us connect to them, and they actually came to our service and spoke there, and we've stayed connected with them and active in their programming ever since, which I think has been a really valuable connection for us.
Well, there was one other thing that was outside of the local area, and that is that there was an article about this whole story and what we had done, in the UU world. And that was, that was very gratifying and important that it get out there.
Mm-hmm. And there was also a piece in New Hampshire Public Radio as well.
Yeah.
So we also as a congregation have continued to talk about the Campbells. And for several years we've done it in a kind of haphazard way. So it would be whenever we felt like, oh, there's enough new people that we need to tell this story again, we would tell it again. And this year we decided we wanted to make it a little bit more systematic, to actually put it in our calendar, our church year calendar each year, that we have a day that we remember the Campbells. And we didn't want it to be just talk, right? I think from the beginning it has felt really important to us that sharing this story is not the end of what we do, but that it is a reminder of our commitment to work for a world where white supremacy isn't a part of who we are as Unitarian Universalists. And, even bigger than that, isn't a part of who we are as people in the world. And so this past year, we, just a few weeks ago, actually, we had our first annual Campbell Day of Action. And I'd love for someone to talk about that a little bit. What did we do for that?
So there were actually 2 or 3 different activities. One was sort of short workshop discussions between various of our racial and social justice teams with the congregation, giving some almost like an annual report of what's been happening, and more importantly, how other people might be involved in some of these things. To again, it's kind of an educational process for the rest of the congregation.
One of the workshops was presented by one of the members of our congregation who is a state representative up in Concord. And she talked about how that governing body works and how we can get our voices heard. It was a very sort of instructive workshop.
Yeah. And we, alongside that, had opportunities for people to actually have their voice heard that day. We are in New Hampshire, our state legislature gives us ample opportunities to express our values by introducing lots of bills that aren't in line with our values. And so we had a station where people could sign in and express their opinion about certain bills coming up, which is one of the ways that our representatives and senators get a pulse of where people are at on particular bills. And we also had a station where people could write postcards to their elected officials in our state government. And as a small state, in bigger states that may not make as much of a difference, but in a small state like New Hampshire, people really read those. Our representatives are not representing that many people, so they really pay attention to the words of their constituents. So it felt like a powerful way in this moment for us to take action.
Another part of the Campbell Day of Action included activities for children. So I remember on that day being with my 2 kids, designing some protest signs. Or I didn't do any of the, no, I ended up making my own sign, and then my daughter just went off and did her own thing, which we then used, then got used.
Yeah, so we now have a pile of Love in Action protest signs here at the church that our kids made that day. And after all the workshops were done, a group of us headed over to the cemetery. Harry, you want to share about that?
Yeah, so again, it was like not necessarily a reenactment, but a restatement sort of our commitment to this work. So after the service and taking some of a ribbon wreath that the children had made, we gathered again at the gravesite in the local cemetery here, and to put the flowers on the grave and the wreath and so forth. And Gloria Timmons, the membership VP of the local NACP chapter, laid a bouquet of flowers. So it was really a very moving service again. Again, sort of recognizing or reinforcing the idea that these three people really who had sort of been disappeared by not just society but our ancestors, our religious ancestors, had just been disappeared, and that really seemed like it felt very good to try to make that right as much as we possibly could.
So I'd love to hear, after going through this process of research and learning and sharing and doing some action, how has this project changed each of you?
It was really hard for me. I was very disappointed by the history of the history. And Roy said earlier, this wasn't 150 years ago. This was, 40 years ago. And I pulled away and I said, this isn't the faith that they say it is. And it really put me into a place of discernment and lots of reading and lots of studying and trying to decide if this is the right place for me. And I have come to the conclusion that it is, that there probably is no church that has done too much better than us. So, and this work is very important, and this is a way to do the work. So I was never not committed to do the work, but now I am also committed to do it through the UU lens.
Just following up on what Kathy said, is in several places in his writings and letters, he talks about the disparity, the contradiction between what the church preaches and what it does. And, that is something that we struggle with today. It was very overt and very blatant in his life experience, but it isn't over, so, we still have to deal with it. Not to mention our broader society.
So going back to Jeffrey Campbell's own writings, I think for me just those words from the letter to Dottie where he said that he would still undertake the call, he had his life to relive, that really stuck with me in a powerful way, because it just said so clearly how much he valued the Unitarian Universalist faith, and it made me have to reflect on, if he could find this much value in it despite being constantly rejected or pushed away, then this faith really is something special and something to be held on to.
I think I've always been more of a loner and not a really activist kind of person, but becoming involved in this project, first of all, it was kind of a real shock to discover that our spiritual ancestors, which we had come to revere as always being on the side of right, had apparently not comported themselves well in at least what I would call our current understanding of social justice. This was really stunning to me, and it was kind of like the motivating thing about it, I think, for me. And it wasn't. I've never felt like there was a really big thing that I can do, but this was kind of a small thing in a way, just, you know, a small group of us who did the initial research. And to me, I'm actually very proud of what we have accomplished and what I've accomplished. I think I've grown through this process. I certainly believe that my friends here have grown through this process. And the hope is, of course, that our church and the community has also grown through this process. This discovery that that this family was treated so badly, to me, is just a stunning. Well, it is a fact of history. So, you know, let's do more history.
Let's do better.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, you know, to your point, Harry, I do think it has changed our congregation as well, this work. I think a piece of that is that we're in New Hampshire, which often we talk about New Hampshire as a white state, and we're in Unitarian Universalism, and often we talk about Unitarian Universalism as a white denomination, and so we are in what we sometimes categorize as a white denomination in a white state, and yet this story tells us that's not true, right? And not only is it not true right now, which we know by looking at our congregation, but also that it has not been true. It has never been true, right? That there are here in New Hampshire stories of Black Unitarian Universalists, and so we can't tell that story. We can't tell that narrative anymore. We can no longer say we can't do racial justice work here because we've never encountered people of color, right? Or they've never been a part of our congregation.
Yep.
That's simply not true. And I think that has really opened people's eyes in our congregation, and made us think about ourselves and our spiritual ancestors differently. And I think it's also opened the door to other research and other ways of delving into our past. One of the outgrowths of this was a group looking into the land that our congregation is on, and also where our wealth came from. And that has been powerful work of rethinking about where we are in the north. Of northern part of the United States, but we were not untouched by slavery. Most of the wealth of our congregation comes from the cotton mills here in the early 1800s, and it was slaves who were picking that cotton. So our wealth comes directly from that. So I think it's opened up doors for our congregation and for ways of rethinking about our history and who we have been. And I think the way, I think it's changed our congregation for the better, is that now we are preaching Jeffrey Campbell's words here, right? He had this, Roy talked about how he shared that he had never been invited to preach from this pulpit. And I think we still feel a lot of disappointment that wasn't something that the congregation got to experience here. But now, at least once a year, we are sharing his words from our pulpit. And so, even though he's not around anymore, it feels like he gets to preach here, at least a little bit every year. So I'd love to hear, when we're thinking about other congregations embarking on these kinds of projects and delving into their own history, what's your advice? What's your advice for them?
Just go looking, I mean, there's a lot of literature out there, like Marson Reed's material. I mean, this church wasn't the only church he wrote about. Also, think of your church in its historical context, and that might inspire some avenues of investigation. I mean, Allison mentioned the connection between this Northeastern church and slavery. We still have a lot more research to do on that. And I think that is probably true for many other UU churches up north and in the northeast.
And I would say, as you jump in and get excited about the research and learn things, expect pushback from folks who don't want to accept the truth. Who, there may be people who feel personally, that you're personally attacking them. There might be folks who say, oh, you know, it was a different time. There'll be a lot of justifications about what happened, and don't give up.
Yeah, I would say just prepare for a lot of complexity, prepare for not finding all the answers to the questions that you want. But also I think it's good to have discrete projects to be working on with this kind of material. So have something like the sermon that we did, or have something like the display that we made. So even if you don't have answers to all of your questions, you have something to share with the larger congregation.
Is there anything you'd add, Harry?
Be skeptical of what you've been told.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I think, as we discovered, I think these stories are in every congregation's past.
How
It
could
doesn't
they not
matter.
be?
Yeah.
To imagine
We're
that-
in America.
Right, to imagine that somehow the United States exists and the things that exist in the United States are here, but we somehow are magically, removed from them, that's a mistake.
Yeah.
We are not magically removed. We are absolutely in the thick of it, like everyone is. The other thing to consider, you were saying we're a white state in a white congregation in a white religion. So we shouldn't focus on these racial justice issues. It's important to remember when you're doing this research that you too have a race. White is a race too. And so people say, well, I don't have to worry about that because all those others are over there. No, we're all in this together, I think. So the systems of the United States, while the Constitution does have some lovely Native American ideas, and it is absolutely based in the European Enlightenment, and those are all, white male European people, and the hierarchical structure of the church, and the hierarchical structure of the state. I personally, if I go to a church and for the first time, and I sit down and here's the pulpit and here's the choir, and I always think, how much like a courtroom this looks, right? This is such, the patterns repeat and repeat and repeat, and to imagine that the pattern of white supremacy doesn't repeat is ridiculous. Of course it does. And we are a piece of that. And the good news is that because we are a piece of that, we can change it. We can change our relationship to the past by looking at it carefully and saying, wow, this was the past, let's change it. So I think that's why you should study history, so you could see your place there. And it is never, if you're studying American history and you're an American history, you're never outside it looking in. You are always, part of that corporation. So.
So part of what makes the study of history special is that by sorting through all of these documents, you get to decide who you are going to pay attention to at that moment. And there are lots of traces, faint or otherwise, of people who in their day, their voice might not have been very loud, their voice might not have been heard very often, but you as a historian at that moment, when you are reading in the archive, you can decide to listen to their voice, and you can then share their words with the people that you are sharing your history with. And that's important because there are lots of people out there who don't want you practicing history like this. They want you to just get your history from statues that they themselves build. So refuse to settle for that. Do your own historical research, decide which voices you're going to listen to, and create your own audiences for the histories that you write.
Yeah, I think sometimes people don't think of history as activism. But I think the fact that there is so much effort going into trying to stop us from teaching history. I know here in New Hampshire, we had a bill passed a few years ago saying that we couldn't talk about any divisive concepts in our public schools. And you look at history and it's all divisive concepts, right? And so the fact that people are working so hard to try to silence these stories tells you something about their power and about the power of telling everyone's stories from all parts of history. And that to me is proof that history is social justice too. The study of history is an act of justice.
You got some serious editing to do.
So much editing.